Paris, the Théâtre des Champs-Élysées, the 15th of May, 1913. Sergei Diaghilev presents a very strange new ballet called Jeux, Games. With music by Claude Debussy and sets and costumes by Leon Bakst, Václav Nijinsky has devised and choreographed a single scene in which he himself dances the part of a tennis player who is with two girls in a garden at dusk. A ball has been lost, and all three of them are searching for it. The program note explains that the artificial light of the large electric lamps shedding fantastic rays about them suggests the idea of childish games. They play hide and seek, they try to catch one another, they quarrel, they sulk without cause. The night is warm, the sky is bathed in pale light. They embrace. But the spell is broken by another tennis ball thrown in mischievously by an unknown hand. Surprised and alarmed, the boy and the girls disappear into the nocturnal depths of the garden. Jeux puzzled the audience, musically as well as scenically. Many decades had to elapse before much later avant-gardists Pierre Boulez and Jean Barraquet were to praise Debussy's strangely illusory score with its constantly fluctuating tempo pulses as a major innovation of its own kind, and as radical as anything that Diaghilev had presented in the first 5 years of the Ballets Russes' life. And Jeux had such an unconventional new kind of choreography for a ballet that it also took many years before Nijinsky's innovation was understood. There was no conventional dancing at all, and the characterization was wholly unlike anything seen in ballet before. The famous dancer and pedagogue Dame Marie Rambert, who was assisting with the production, remembered the occasion many years later in a talk that she was giving about Nijinsky and Diaghilev at the Royal Opera House, Covent Garden. And we are extremely grateful to the Royal Opera House Collections for enabling us to include her recollections here.
The extraordinary thing about Jeux was that Nijinsky was really the first choreographer to bring on a contemporary man on the stage. Up to then, people were princes, and then knights, and then romantic heroes, and all beautiful things like that. And all of a sudden, he brought a man of today. That is, of the day was 1913. It's curious, was very amusing, the rehearsal, because the first costume that Bach designed for Nijinsky was appalling. He wore shorts, what was called then shorts, but what today would be called longs. Long shorts, showing in the most unbecoming way a male bare knee and male bare calves with socks. And he looked like a hideously overdeveloped little boy. A shirt with red braces. I mean, such and a red wig, curly. Why that was the idea of Bach. Diaghilev was sitting in the dress circle, and Bach was sitting near the stage. And Diaghilev said, Lyovushka, that's a pet name for Leon, for Lev. Lyovushka, that won't do. He said, Seriozenka, it's again, and it's so tender. Serge, dear, dear, that will do. She said, no, what an epic quarrel. And I think Bach left the theater, and Diaghilev sent his two ladies to Paquin, who was then the great couturier, who cut for them elegant little tennis skirts with what was called then chandail, with collars. And Nijinsky was dressed by Diaghilev. He said he will wear his class uniform only made in white, because at that time men wore trousers for classes. We weren't so used yet to nakedness as we are today. And thank heaven, I mean, I wouldn't like everybody to have to wear those trousers again. Long trousers caught at the ankle so that they could do grand battement and everything like that. But that was made in white, and an ordinary white shirt without any braces and rolled sleeves, and it was perfect.
The characters of this ballet are like moths in the night, like children who do not know the rules of the game that they are playing. And that is how Sergei Diaghilev described Jeux to Leon Bakst. Just a fortnight before, there was to be a volcanic explosion at the Ballet Russe. Diaghilev himself was sure that exactly that was going to happen, and he privately predicted a scandal well in advance of the opening night of Le Sacre du Printemps, the Rite of Spring, with music by Igor Stravinsky, choreography by Václav Nijinsky, and stage designs and costumes by another vital Diaghilev figure, the painter, theatre designer and archaeological researcher Nicholas Roerich. It was no coincidence that the premiere of The Rite of Spring was scheduled for the same month date in 1913 as the scandalous L'après-midi d'un faune the previous year. Diaghilev was superstitious, and so for now, May the 29th was a red-letter day. But could even he have predicted just how intense the reaction would be in the Théâtre des Champs-Élysées on the upcoming May the 29th in 1913? Certainly the subject matter was completely outside what a ballet audience expected, even the kind of audience that had been weaned on Diaghilev's previous innovations. Entirely conceived by Stravinsky, The Rite of Spring was crucially developed with him by Roerich, who had profoundly researched pagan ritual in ancient Russia. In a pagan rite, a young adolescent girl is chosen to be offered as a human sacrifice to the god of spring, in the hope that the god will enable spring to come again, and with it the continuation of life. But even that confrontational and wholly unfamiliar kind of theme was just the beginning of the story of one of the greatest scandals in theatrical history, when a real physical riot broke out as supporters and antagonists started to fight each other. The music, which was so totally unfamiliar in style that it had received 17 full rehearsals under Pierre Monteux, was often ferociously barbaric, with pounding and dislocating irregular rhythms and screeching discords from a colossal-size orchestra. And on stage there was often a display of primeval and primitive grotesqueness that horrified the conservative regulars and thrilled the progressives. There was also a great deal of strangely magical mystery in the music, but that got drowned out by all the noise in the auditorium fairly soon after the beginning of the performance. Dancing in that historic first night of the Rite of Spring was Des Marie Rambert.
People began to hiss, other people began to applaud. We couldn't hear a note on the stage. One just watched carefully Pierre Monteux in the orchestra to try and be in time, and Nijinsky himself was in the wings. And it was an absolute pandemonium. There was a lady a very elegant lady, who leaned out of her box like that, hit a man in the face, slapped. But I can't remember whether she was hissing or whether she was clapping. But all I can say is that he obviously was doing the opposite.
The Rite of Spring brought primeval terror as well as eerie mystery to the ballet stage in a way that intensely shocked a great many people. And in the extraordinary originality and total novelty of both its music and its choreography, it became one of the most influentially revolutionary creations in artistic history, not only for later composers and choreographers, but also for performers. For a start, the orchestra, conductor and dancers had to learn how to cope with unprecedented kinds of abruptly changing rhythmic meters, dissonant harmonic key relationships, and angular musical lines. Under the remarkably sure and brave leadership of Pierre Monteux conducting, we have a possible idea of how it may all have finally sounded back then in 1913, with the example of this historic recording coming up now that was conducted by Monteux in Paris 16 years later in 1929. The work was very much still considered terrifyingly difficult and problematic to perform at that time. And the dancers, rehearsing for 6 whole months before the premiere, had to adopt positions and stances that contradicted virtually everything they had learnt in classical ballet.
In sacre, the feet were turned in to make this feeling of prehistoric, hardly human creatures, and the arms were like this, with the fists slightly closed. There was walking, there was running, there was stamping, and there was jumping. Jumping on both feet or jumping onto one foot of both feet. He managed to such a degree realize in movement the music of Stravinsky. He insisted so much on underlining in the dancing every note of the music. I was preparing rehearsals with him, and I said, but couldn't you do some counterpoint here? Why insist on doing every note? He said, no, because it's so beautiful. I want every note to be. So it was marked either by a stamp of the foot or by a movement of the arm or by a jerk of the head. But anyhow, he absolutely translated the music. And that gave additional greatness to his ballet, because certainly the music of sacre is great.
Although Nijinsky's astoundingly innovative choreography was most unfortunately lost not so long after the premiere, nearly 3/4 of a century later, after nearly 18 years of work, 2 extraordinarily brilliant researchers and experts, Millicent Hodgson and Kenneth Archer, were able to make a very impressive reconstruction of what they believed was a close approximation of how Le Sacre du Printemps had appeared to the audience in 1913. And their remarkable performing version is now in the repertoire of many companies. Millicent Hodgson explains the history and background.
The recreation or the reconstruction of the choreography for Le Sacre du Printemps could never be exactly what Nijinsky did, because there isn't the documentation for the exact reproduction, and even if there were, it would never look the same on dancers today as it did then. But I was so struck when I was a student at Berkeley with some of the photographs that I found in the rare books library there that had photographs of the original production in 1913. They suddenly struck me with how contemporary they were. I had no idea that The Rite of Spring was such an extraordinary breakthrough in choreography until I really looked at those photographs. And because of the costumes being hand-painted by Nicholas Roerich, the scenarist and the designer of the piece, there was something that was so clearly modern in the realization of these archaic designs. They weren't painted as an archaic tribe would paint them. There was an edge that was something that I realized I heard in the music. You hear these archaic sounds, which in fact I learned much later Stravinsky had actually used these ancient chants and different kinds of Mongolian trance music and other sources that he used and reordered. And I suddenly realized that the whole production was this archetypal idea of an enormous breakthrough in nature for spring, but that it was recast as this breakthrough in a modern archaic style.
Referring to The Rite of Spring and what Rurik achieved there, I think one of the most fascinating elements of the Millicent Hodgson, Kenneth Archer reconstruction of the ballet was for one to see such a colourful staging. Now, we're talking about recent times, it's making a very strong impact. So what it was like in 1913, it would be very much stronger. And what a powerful impact that must have made.
And we can hear now from a very distinguished former principal dancer of the Royal Ballet, Baroness Deborah Bull. She's now Vice Principal London at King's College, London, what it was like dancing the role of the chosen one, the sacrificial victim, in Millicent Hodgson's and Kenneth Archer's reconstruction of Václav Nijinsky's original choreography.
What absolutely struck me was the boldness of the language and how that must have seemed to the dancers in the year in which it was made. I mean, here were dancers being asked to turn their feet inwards, whereas a ballet dancer's feet are normally at 10 to 2, pointing outwards. They were being asked to hunch over, to angle their heads in what would have seemed a very ugly way, to clasp their hands together like spatulas rather than in that rather lovely balletic grouping of the fingers. They were being asked to be much more perhaps abstract in the expression of emotion rather than literal or narrative. And I think what's fascinating for me as a 20th century artist, not quite 21st century, although I sort of spilled over, what's fascinating for me is to see what that led to and how that presaged the development of contemporary dance, but you can absolutely see how that all grew out of that first step that Nijinsky took.
And the sacrificial dance, the danse sacrale, as the young chosen victim dances herself to death for the sacrifice, was in 1913 maybe the very most daringly innovative scene of the entire ballet, in both the music and the dancing.
What is most remarkable in terms of choreography, it's the whole ordeal that he created for the dancers, the concentration of energy, the depth of weight in the body, the way the dancers use it. But they don't only use it for movement, they use it for music. They use it for creating sound. I think I should give you an example. In the Dance of the Chosen One, there's a very well-documented section in which the Chosen One, because she's trapped in the center of the circle and she has to dance herself to death in order to save the earth, she goes through various degrees of isolation in this experience. And one of the ways that she copes, of course, at the beginning is to try to escape from this circle where she's entrapped. After she realizes that she can't get out, according to the notes of Nijinsky, Nijinsky's sister, on whom he created the solo, even though she became pregnant and didn't perform it, in her notes she says that the chosen one then realizes that she won't escape, and like a bird, like a prehistoric bird, she starts to make a nest. And she scratches, she beats her feet and her body in a particular rhythm. As it happened, after I'd found those notes, sometime later I had the Stravinsky notes, not the ones that are produced in the back of his Rite of Spring sketches, which are very clear and very accessible, but later notes that I did not have access to at the beginning that were within the Stravinsky family. On those very measures, where the chosen one is becoming this bird and making this nest, in other words, accepting the fact she can't escape and somehow domesticating her situation, there is the markings of exactly the rhythm that she is supposed to beat, which is a 6. She has to beat a 6 on top of a 5. If I could dare to make the noise, I'll show you what it sounds like with the hands. She goes. So this is very, very difficult for the dancer to do, first with the feet, and then with the hands, and then the feet and the hands together. Then she runs to the edge, and she makes these beats again, and then she runs back to the center. So this is an expression of the ritual significance of the rhythm, the body rhythm. It's not just that Nijinsky makes a percussion score on top of the music. It's that it all has a meaning in terms of the situation for this woman who can't escape the circle where she has been entrapped.
The wise elders offer their god Yarilo the sacrifice of the chosen girl who has danced herself to death, and the curtain falls on Stravinsky's Le Sacre du Printemps, the rite of spring, first seen and heard on May the 29th, 1913 at the Théâtre des Champs-Élysées in Paris, in the 5th season of Sergei Diaghilev's Ballets Russes. And the entire world of music and dance had been completely revolutionized, turned upside down, in just 32 minutes.
I think we can say there was before and there was after, because Sacre, first from a point of view musically, has been definitely the equivalent for me as Les Demoiselles d'Avignon from Picasso. It's when suddenly a composer propose something that makes you understand that never after it will be the same, that the perception of music, the perception of rhythm, the perception of understanding how the music reflect into the emotion of people will change forever, and especially when it's combined with such a strong proposition in the choreography where suddenly everything also is put back in question. We've believed for so many years that dance only had one possibility of codification, and then suddenly comes somebody like Václav Nijinsky, whose first of all, a great dancer, and already as a dancer, put a big question into the way we should perceive dance. And then suddenly his proposition with the choreography, where everything is completely in verse, where the demonstration doesn't happen, when the corps de ballet become the center of the vision, when there is not only one point to the center, but many points onto the stage, where the stage is really considered as a frame, like a painting could propose, where he considered that the exhibition of the technique is become definitely something that is secondary, where he realized that dance can mean something more than just the emotion of the movement by himself. And if in our days, I think we passed 100 proposition of version known with Sacre du Printemps, mean that this kind of revolution only happens one every century. So definitely there was an before and there will be an after, because it took a century to digest and comprehend the real deepness of what musically they proposed and choreographically they proposed.